Hey y'all, I'm Renee and welcome to Tater Town. Today we're going to talk about something that I just talked about, or I just did a short on. We're going to do a long version because I've got so many questions about using your chicken's eggshells to supplement their calcium. And I wanted to be able to give you more details that I just couldn't put into the short. So here it goes. We all know that laying hens need calcium in their diet in order to make those hard shells. And if their diet is lacking in calcium, then they're going to start laying soft-shelled eggs. And their body's also going to start pulling that calcium from their bones in order to make those shells. And that can cause all kinds of issues. As some of you feed your laying hens layer feed, and that has added calcium. But sometimes some chickens may need more or less than what's in the feed. And if you're like me, I have a mixed flock. I have a rooster who certainly doesn't need the calcium, and I'm not going to separate him at feeding time. And also, if you have young non-laying pullets with your laying hens, you don't want to feed them calcium until they're old enough to lay. So what do you do? What do you do, Miss Donna? Well, I feed everyone a basic grower feed since grower feed has no calcium. I then have a separate container that I put oyster shells in so that they have access to it at all times. And chickens are great at knowing what they need, so they're going to eat whatever amount of oyster shell to fill that calcium gap. Just a reminder that oyster shell is not grit. Grit is something else that they need, but oyster shell does not check that grit box. So why on earth would you feed your chickens eggshells back to them? Well, let's talk about eggshells. An eggshell is about 95% natural calcium carbonate. The calcium that they get from those oyster shells goes right to making that hard shell that they lay. And 1/2 of an eggshell provides approximately 750 milligrams of calcium. Of course, it depends on the size of the shell. The smaller the shell, the less, the bigger, the more. But they also contain other necessary minerals. And that membrane in the eggshell that always sticks when you're trying to get the shells off, well, the membrane is protein in the form of collagen and also has some glucosamine, chondroitin, and other nutrients. What are you guys doing? She's picking my pants. The cool thing is, you yourself can eat those eggshells as a supplement. Now, I use the eggshells to supplement the calcium they get from the oyster shells. And you may be thinking, well, why don't I just use eggshells as a supplement instead of oyster shells? And unfortunately, the girls don't keep me stocked in eggs all the time, so I would definitely not be able to keep up with their calcium needs with just using their eggshells. But it does cut down on the cost of relying solely on the oyster shells. And the chickens go crazy for it. They definitely like them so much better than the oyster shells. But shifting gears, I wanted to go over some details that I couldn't get to in the short. First, some of you may be asking, won't this lead to them eating their eggs? In my experience, I'm going to say no, but here's why. You're going to crush those eggshells into tiny pieces that have no resemblance whatsoever to the egg. So they won't necessarily make that connection. Also, most egg eating happens if they're lacking in calcium or if they're bored or by accident, but I've never had them eat eggs after I started supplementing with eggshells. And if you do have an issue with egg eating, you do not have to cull the chicken. You can break that habit. Now, why did I say crush and not powdered? Powdered eggshells will not hurt the chicken, but they probably won't eat it if it's powdered and given to them in a bowl. They like small enough pieces that they can grab onto and eat. And even if the piece is just a little big, they'll break it with their beak until it's the right size for them. But powdered could be okay if you're mixing it in with, say, fermented feed or some sort of wet food. But if you mix it into their pellets or mash, dry mash, most likely it's going to end up wasted at the bottom of the bowl or on the ground. So what do you do with the shells once you've collected them? Well, you definitely want to rinse the shells. You don't need to wash them with soap and water, but make sure they're being rinsed as you collect them and put them into whatever container you're using to save them. As for baking them, there's 2 reasons for this. First and foremost, baking is used to kill any bacteria or bad stuff that's hanging out on the shell. Some people even boil them first before baking as extra insurance, but that's totally up to you. Baking also ensures that the shells are dry before crushing and storing. This is especially important if you're not giving the shells to your chickens all at once and you're storing them. The last thing you want is moisture creating mold and toxins. Yes, Annie. I'm certainly not a germaphobe, but I do like to be on the cautious side, especially if I'm going to eat the shells, and I definitely want to be cautious if I'm giving advice. Which brings me to the next topic. Can you do this with store-bought eggs? Technically, yes. An egg bought at the store is still made of calcium carbonate. But there's a bunch of variables, and here's why I wouldn't, especially in the United States. First, I know what my chickens are being fed, if they're sick, what diseases they may have been exposed to. Basically, I know a lot about that shell when it comes from my birds. But I know nothing about a store-bought egg, except that in the United States, government regulations require that the U.S. Department of Agriculture, their graded eggs have to be carefully washed and sanitized. I have no idea what's in that sanitizer, but I certainly don't want to eat it, and I don't want my chickens to either. And I know a lot of other countries, they do not allow washing of the egg or sanitizing the egg before hitting the stores, but the United States does. And I'd rather not take the chance if I can avoid it. So it's totally up to your comfort level, whether you want to do this with store-bought eggs or not. And remember when I mentioned earlier that you could also eat the shells as a supplement? Well, that's the other reason I like to make sure I know where the shells come from and that they're cleaned and baked appropriately so I don't get sick. It's also why you may choose to grind some of the shells into a powder. Though I do know some people who eat the shells crushed added to their food. Kind of crunchy, right? Personally, I prefer using it as a powder. Really, the whole eggshell eating thing sounds crazy, but it's totally a thing. And you can even buy eggshell supplements online or at your local health food stores. That's how much of a thing it is. Anyhow, I hope that clears up some questions you may have or give you a bit more insight as to why I supplement my chickens and sometimes even myself with eggshells. Let me know in the comments if you have any other questions or if you already use eggshells as a supplement. Well, what's your experience been like? And do you do something differently? How do you do it? I'd love to hear from you. But thank you again for taking the time out from your day to check out this video and for joining me here on Tatertown. Right, little girl?